Hello, and welcome to the Silent Empires. If you're new here, please subscribe and like the video to support the channel. You can also support us by sending a super thanks on this video. Your support truly helps the channel grow. Now relax and enjoy the story.
In February 2008, federal prosecutors in Brooklyn unsealed an indictment that read like a closing chapter in the long story of New York's traditional mafia. The document ran for pages, listing decades of alleged crimes: gambling, extortion, loan sharking, labor racketeering. Buried in the middle of that stack of paper was a name that the general public barely knew, but that investigators had been circling for years: Joseph Jojo Corozzo. In court filings and press conferences, law enforcement described him as the consigliere of the Gambino crime family, an elder statesman and quiet strategist for an organization once led by the famously flamboyant John Gotti. Unlike Gotti, Corozzo had spent most of his life avoiding cameras and headlines, preferring side doors, coded conversations, and the kind of anonymity that kept people alive in his world. To the prosecutors in that Brooklyn courtroom, he represented something stubborn and enduring, the last, low-key embodiment of an old underworld tradition that had taken root in New York long before he was born. To understand who he was and how he came to stand there, you have to rewind the story to a very different Brooklyn in the middle of a very different century. Joseph Corozzo entered the world in 1942, in the middle of the Second World War, at a time when New York City was both the beating heart of American industry and a crowded landing point for immigrant families still trying to find their footing. He was born into a large Italian-American household in Brooklyn, part of a generation whose parents or grandparents had crossed the Atlantic from southern Italy in search of stability and opportunity. They found tenements and factory work, crowded schoolrooms and narrow streets, but also a tight web of neighbors, cousins, and paesani who helped one another navigate a city where their accents and last names still marked them as outsiders. In these neighborhoods, the church, the family, and the street all exerted powerful gravitational pulls, and boys grew up learning quickly that respect, protection, and money were unevenly distributed, and that there were informal ways of evening the odds. The Brooklyn of Corozzo's childhood was a borough of stark contrasts. By the 1942, the city's official power rested in City Hall and the police precincts, but in many Italian-American neighborhoods, another, quieter structure of authority coexisted alongside it. Shopkeepers knew which local figures to greet with deference, which men could smooth over a problem with a landlord, help with a job, or recover stolen property when the official channels failed. Historians of organized crime describe this as a kind of parallel governance: informal, men of respect, who settled disputes, collected debts, and sometimes provided real assistance, but who also used fear and illegal activity to build their influence. It was into this world not yet fully visible to him as a child, but embedded in the social fabric around him, that Joseph grew up. New York's Italian underworld had been consolidating itself for decades before his birth. The bloody power struggles of the Prohibition era in the 1920s had given way by the early 1930s to a more ordered system, the so-called Five Families, that would dominate New York organized crime for the next half-century. One of those was the organization that would eventually bear the Gambino name. In Joseph's earliest years, it was still known to law enforcement as the Mangano family, after boss Vincent Mangano. In 1951, Mangano disappeared and was presumed murdered. Not long after, his feared underboss, Albert Anastasia, took over. Anastasia's reign, marked by his reputation for ruthlessness, coincided with the years when Joseph was entering adolescence. By the time Joseph was approaching 15, Anastasia himself had been assassinated in a barber chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan, making the front pages of the city's newspapers. His replacement, Carlo Gambino, would quietly transform that same organization into the most powerful crime family in New York, and the one that would later claim Joseph, according to prosecutors and investigators, as one of its senior figures. For a boy growing up in post-war Brooklyn, these headline-grabbing events were more than distant stories about men in suits. They formed part of the background noise of everyday life. Newsstands displayed photographs of crime bosses led into court in handcuffs alongside baseball scores and movie advertisements. Older men in the neighborhood muttered opinions about who was strong, who was finished, who had made a mistake. In Italian barbershops and social clubs, the names Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Bonanno, and Profaci, later Colombo, might be spoken carefully, if at all, but their influence could be felt in how business was done on the docks, in the garment district, and in construction yards. For young Italian-American men like Joseph and his brothers, the message was clear without ever being printed on a sign. There were official paths into the American mainstream, through school and steady work, and there were unofficial paths that promised faster money, a particular kind of respect, and, just as often, danger. Joseph was part of a large sibling group. Among his brothers was Nicholas, born several years after him, who would later be known in law enforcement files and news reports as Nicholas Little Nick Corozzo, an alleged high-ranking figure in the same Gambino organization. Another brother, Blaze, would also be linked by prosecutors to Gambino activities decades later. In their youth, though, they were simply part of a crowded Brooklyn family sharing limited space and resources. Accounts that emerged much later, in court documents and journalistic profiles, suggest that the Corozzo children experienced a version of the same story lived by countless Italian-American families in mid-century New York. Modest means, parents who worked hard to support them, and a constant negotiation between old country traditions and the new realities of American urban life. The household they grew up in was not unique, but the choices that some of its sons would eventually make would draw the attention of law enforcement for decades. Public records provide only scattered glimpses of Joseph's earliest years, and he himself never courted the kind of publicity that would have produced detailed personal profiles. Like most children in Brooklyn at the time, he would have attended local public schools, navigating crowded classrooms where the sons of recent immigrants sat beside the grandchildren of earlier waves from Ireland, Eastern Europe, and elsewhere. Outside of school hours, the street was its own classroom. In neighborhoods like his, boys learned which blocks were safe, which corners were controlled by particular groups, and which storefronts doubled as social clubs for local toughs. Those clubs, often with innocuous names and dusty card tables inside, were part of the everyday landscape. Federal agents would later focus their surveillance on such places as hubs of mob activity, but for neighborhood kids, they were first and foremost a reminder that some local men wielded influence that didn't come with a badge. At the national level, official attitudes toward organized crime began to shift during Joseph's youth. In the early 1952, Senator Estes Kefauver held televised hearings into crime and corruption, pulling back the curtain, however imperfectly, on the world of illegal gambling, racketeering, and political bribery. In 1957, when Joseph was about 15 years old, New York State Police famously raided a gathering of dozens of suspected mafia leaders in Appalachian, a small town upstate. The image of well-dressed men fleeing through the woods to escape law enforcement made the news across the country. For Italian-American families in New York, these events were a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they validated rumors that an organized underworld existed. On the other, they reinforced stereotypes that painted entire communities with the brush of criminality. Young men like Joseph were growing up at a time when their ethnicity and their neighborhoods were increasingly, and sometimes unfairly, associated in the public imagination with organized crime. This tension between legitimate frustration at corruption and unfair suspicion cast on a whole community formed part of the social air Joseph breathed as he came of age. Many Italian-American parents, having worked menial or unstable jobs, pushed their children towards safer, more conventional careers, civil service positions, trades, or college, for those who could manage it. Others, however, acknowledged privately that the local underworld could, and did, provide real material benefits to people they knew: a loan when banks refused, a job on the docks, help dealing with a violent landlord. Where official institutions had failed, these networks stepped in, even if their methods were illegal or coercive. This ambiguity, criminals who nonetheless could be seen by some neighbors as problem solvers or protectors, complicated the moral landscape, confronting a teenager deciding what kind of man to become. By the early 1960 seconds, when Joseph was entering his 20s, the Gambino organization he would later be tied to was at the peak of its power under Carlo Gambino. The family exercised influence over key industries: the waterfront, trucking, construction, and parts of the garment trade. Illegal gambling remained a central moneymaker, from policy games and sports betting to card games in back rooms. Loan sharking, lending money at high interest to people shut out of the banking system, brought both profit and control. These activities were accompanied, according to numerous indictments and witness testimonies, by the threat or reality of violence, though the details of such acts were usually kept out of public view. The very success of this system depended on most people seeing only the surface: the social clubs, the friendly favors, the sense that powerful unseen hands could arrange things. For someone growing up in the right or wrong corner of Brooklyn, it was almost impossible not to be aware of this parallel economy, even if one chose never to be part of it. At the same time, the federal government was slowly building new tools to confront the structure of organized crime. In 1963, when Joseph was in his early 20s, a former soldier in the Genovese family named Joe Valakai testified publicly before a United States Senate committee, becoming the first insider to openly describe the existence of a national criminal organization known among its members as Cosa Nostra. His televised testimony introduced many Americans to the idea of a coordinated mafia with rules, hierarchies, and rituals. For men already involved in, or on the fringes of, that world, it demonstrated that secrecy could be breached and that the government was learning how their systems worked. In 1970, with Joseph in his late 20s, Congress passed the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, which allowed prosecutors to treat an entire pattern of criminal conduct, not just individual acts, as a single enterprise. The stage was being set for the sweeping cases that would one day entangle men like Joseph, even as, in their daily lives, many of them tried to keep a low profile. Through all of this, Joseph Corozzo remained largely invisible to the broader public. Unlike some future Gambino figures whose tempers or vanity drew attention, he did not feature prominently in newspaper crime columns during his youth and early adulthood. That absence of early coverage has left historians with limited, direct evidence about his specific steps into the world that law enforcement would later associate with his name. What can be traced, however, is the pattern. He was a young, Italian-American man, growing up in a borough where one of the most powerful crime families in America was deeply embedded in the local economy and social structure. He belonged to a family whose surname would, over time, appear repeatedly in federal indictments, and he navigated his formative years in the shadow of both neighborhood-level underworld figures and an increasingly determined federal campaign to bring those networks down. By the late 1960 seconds, the gap between the public's understanding of the mafia and the reality on the ground was beginning to narrow. Newspapers wrote of organized crime syndicates, politicians promised crackdowns, and federal agencies devoted more resources to surveillance and long-term investigations. Yet in the neighborhoods where Joseph and his peers lived, much of life went on as usual. Families gathered for Sunday dinners, children played in the streets, and small businesses opened their shutters each morning. The men later identified as mob associates often blended into this ordinary landscape, working nominally legitimate jobs, attending weddings and funerals, appearing as unremarkable neighbors. This duality, the coexistence of the mundane and the illicit, was a defining feature of the environment in which Joseph's character and choices were formed. It was a world in which respect was measured not only by diplomas or official titles, but by who could actually make things happen when a problem needed solving. As he moved from adolescence into manhood, the options available to someone like Joseph were shaped as much by social networks as by personal ambition. In working-class Brooklyn, jobs could be obtained through a relative at the Union Hall, a neighbor who knew someone in the sanitation department, or, in some cases, a local figure tied to the underworld who could arrange a position on the docks or on a truck. The same networks that provided these opportunities could also draw a young man deeper into a culture where loyalty to the group, silence in the face of police questioning, and a willingness to bend or break the law were treated as normal, even necessary behaviors. For many, the line between simply accepting a favor and becoming indebted or involved was not always clearly visible until it had already been crossed. In later years, prosecutors and FBI agents would place Joseph "Jojo" Corozzo near the top of their organizational charts of the Gambino family, portraying him as a trusted counselor and mediator inside a criminal enterprise that had survived multiple wars with law enforcement. That future reputation had its roots in these early decades, in the habits and relationships formed in the tight quarters of Brooklyn's post-war Italian-American neighborhoods. While the specifics of how he first entered the orbit of the Gambino organization remain sparsely documented in public sources, the context is unmistakable. He came of age at a time when the old world code of silence met the new power of federal racketeering laws, when young men in his position faced a set of temptations and pressures that would shape the rest of their lives. It was from this crucible a borough in transition, a community negotiating its identity, and an underworld eager to recruit the capable and the loyal that Joseph Corozzo's path toward notoriety began to emerge. As the 1,960 seconds opened, Joseph Corozzo moved from the sidelines of neighborhood life into the uncertain territory of adulthood. Brooklyn was changing around him. The post-war boom that had filled factories and piers with steady jobs was beginning to fray. Containerization on the docks, the flight of manufacturing to cheaper regions, and the first signs of urban decline were reshaping the economic map of New York. In many working-class Italian neighborhoods, the old formulas stopped working. The union card still mattered, but it no longer guaranteed the same security. For a young man like Joseph, in his late teens and early 20s, the promise of a stable, upwardly mobile life through purely legal means was far from assured. At the same time, the web of informal power that had always existed in the neighborhood seemed, to those who were inclined to see it, as strong as ever. In that world, introductions mattered. Very few people simply walked in off the street and announced a desire to work for the Gambino family or any other mafia group. Instead, young men with the right background and temperament were gradually drawn into the orbit of older associates through relatives, neighbors, and local business owners. The social clubs that lined certain blocks in Brooklyn, some of them nothing more than converted storefronts with neon beer signs in the window and a back room shielded from public view, served as both community centers and, in the eyes of investigators, informal offices for organized crime. For the police or FBI, these places were potential targets for surveillance. For someone like Joseph, growing up only a short walk away, they were simply part of the neighborhood landscape. Over time, according to prosecutors and later testimony from cooperating witnesses, he was no longer just a passerby. Public records do not map out step by step the precise moment when Joseph moved from acquaintance to participant. The underworld left few documents that spelled out job descriptions or promotion dates. What can be pieced together from court filings, law enforcement reports, and interviews with former mob figures is a gradual progression that was typical of his generation. A young associate might start with chores that seemed almost mundane, running small bets for a neighborhood bookmaker, carrying messages between older men who preferred not to be seen together, watching a doorway, or simply showing up when a show of numbers was wanted outside a troubled business. These actions, minor in themselves, tested reliability, discretion, and temperament. In a culture that prized silence in the face of police questioning and loyalty under pressure, a man's reputation was built quietly, long before his name appeared in any indictment. By the mid-1960 seconds, police intelligence units in Brooklyn were already familiar with the Corozzo surname. Patrol officers and detectives working in precincts with heavy Italian-American populations kept informal lists of men who were frequently seen around known mob hangouts. Over time, names that appeared in those notebooks were passed upward to specialized squads and, eventually, to the FBI's burgeoning organized crime units. In later federal prosecutions, agents would note that local police departments had encountered Joseph and some of his brothers, as early as the 1960 seconds, often in connection with what were, at that time, relatively small-scale offenses, illegal gambling, unlicensed money lending, or disputes that had spilled over into the open. Most of these early brushes with the law ended in modest fines, short jail terms, or simply a notation in a report. But taken together, they formed a pattern. To investigators, they were a first sign that the family name belonged to a group of men who operated, at least partly, in the gray zone between legitimate work and organized crime. For the Gambino organization, these were also years of consolidation and quiet prosperity. Under Carlo Gambino, who had taken control in the late 1950 seconds, the family emphasized low-profile efficiency over spectacular violence. Gambino preferred to keep his own name out of the newspapers and encouraged his subordinates to do the same. The family expanded its influence over key unions, including those connected to trucking, construction, and the waterfront. Illegal bookmaking and policy games brought in steady income from gamblers across the city. Loan sharking preyed on small business owners and working people who could not or would not seek help from banks. Through all of these activities, the family developed an internal culture that rewarded men who could generate money, maintain relationships, and keep trouble to a minimum. It was in this environment, according to later accounts, that Joseph "Jojo" Corozzo began to distinguish himself. Neighbors who later spoke on background to reporters often described Joseph in his young adulthood as reserved compared with some of the more flamboyant local toughs. He was not known for loud displays or conspicuous consumption. That self-contained demeanor, unremarkable on its face, was precisely the kind of personality that long-term criminal enterprises valued. While movies and novels popularized the image of the hot-headed mobster, the day-to-day functioning of organizations like the Gambinos depended heavily on men who could quietly run a gambling operation, mediate a dispute over a debt, or represent their superiors in a union hall without drawing unwanted attention. Over time, these skills managing money flows, cultivating contacts, avoiding unnecessary conflict, would help define Joseph's reputation inside his world. As the decade wore on, the broader American landscape was marked by dramatic upheavals, the civil rights movement, anti-war protests, cultural shifts that changed music, fashion, and attitudes toward authority. For most of the Italian-American neighborhoods where the mafia's influence was strongest, however, the rhythms of daily life changed more slowly. Church festivals, family gatherings, and tight-knit social networks continued to organize people's lives. Young men were drafted to fight in Vietnam or found deferments. Families worried about crime and drugs, and older immigrants watched with mixed feelings as their children and grandchildren became more Americanized. Within this context, the traditional mafia offered, to some, a sense of continuity and identity. Its rituals, rules, and hierarchies drew heavily on old country ideas about honor and obligation, even as its actual business was rooted in the very modern economies of unions, construction contracts, and urban vice. By the late 1960 seconds and early 1970 seconds, law enforcement agencies were beginning to respond to organized crime in a more systematic way. The passage of federal racketeering laws created new tools for prosecutors, and the FBI developed specialized squads dedicated solely to Cosa Nostra investigations. Wiretaps and bugs, authorized by courts under stricter standards than in previous decades, started to appear in social clubs and meeting places across the city. The Gambino family, long adept at maintaining a low profile, was not immune to that pressure. Internal caution increased. Conversations that might once have been held over a public payphone moved to quieter locations, and greater care was taken in how money and messages moved up and down the chain of command. For associates like Joseph, this meant learning to navigate an environment where the risks of being overheard or observed were higher than before. It was during this period that multiple law enforcement sources would later place Joseph's transition from a mere associate to a formally initiated member, a made man of the Gambino family. The exact date of his induction is not publicly documented. Such ceremonies were secret by design, and the participants rarely discussed them openly, even after turning government witness. but by the time cooperating witnesses began describing the Gambino hierarchy to federal agents in the 1,980 seconds and 1,990 seconds, Joseph was consistently referred to as someone who had been formally brought into the family and who, for years, had functioned, at least at the level of a soldier. That status, in mafia culture, marked a key turning point. It meant that he had proven himself reliable and profitable enough to warrant full membership, with all its expectations of lifelong loyalty and obedience to the family's leadership. Soldiers in the Gambino family during the 1,970 seconds were often responsible for supervising a small group of associates and overseeing one or more revenue-generating operations. A cluster of bookmakers, a loan sharking route, a few no-show jobs on construction projects, or perhaps an arrangement with a bar or nightclub. External appearances often remained banal. Many of these men held or claimed to hold legitimate jobs, filed tax returns, and appeared to the casual observer as small businessmen or union officials. Inside the organization, however, their duties went beyond the visible. Soldiers were expected to enforce the family's interests, whether that meant pressuring a reluctant debtor, steering a contract to a favored company, or ensuring that a union local voted the right way on a particular issue. They were also a key link between the street and the higher ranks, carrying reports and payments up the ladder while relaying orders downward. During the years when Paul Castellano succeeded Carlo Gambino as boss, beginning in 1976, the internal character of the family began to shift. Castellano, a cousin and brother-in-law of Gambino, came from what was perceived as the more white-collar wing of the organization. He favored schemes that blurred the line between illegality and business complex frauds, control of food distribution, sophisticated labor racketeering over the more traditional gambling and street-level rackets. This focus did not eliminate the older activities, but it did create a tension between crews that operated in blue-collar neighborhoods and those whose base of power lay in boardrooms and union offices. Years later, cooperating witnesses would describe a quiet rivalry between what they called the white-collar and blue-collar factions within the Gambino family. Men like Joseph, operating in and around the working-class neighborhoods of Brooklyn and Queens, stood at this intersection. On one side were the old bases of power, social clubs, corner bookmakers, small businesses that paid for protection and loan shark customers whose livelihoods could be upended by a missed payment. On the other side were the family's expanding interests in larger contracts and commercial ventures, where a different kind of negotiation and a more polished public face were useful. In this environment, the qualities attributed to Joseph by both prosecutors and defense attorneys in later years, discretion, a calm demeanor, and ability to talk through disputes, took on practical importance. He was someone who, according to multiple sources, could carry messages between figures who did not trust one another and help diffuse conflicts before they spilled into open violence that might draw the attention of the press and police. While internal mafia politics were evolving, the outside world was also changing in ways that affected the Gambino family's business. The 1,970 seconds saw the growth of new illicit markets, notably narcotics. Officially, many mafia bosses, including those in the Gambino family, publicly condemned drug dealing as too risky and corrosive, preferring to focus on gambling, extortion, and labor corruption. In practice, however, numerous lower-level members and associates became involved in heroin and cocaine distribution, attracted by the enormous profits. Federal investigations into drug trafficking often intersected with existing organized crime cases, bringing new layers of scrutiny. The Gambino family, like the other New York families, had to navigate the dangers of this expanding market, how to profit from it indirectly, without exposing top leadership to the harsh penalties that drug cases increasingly carried. Throughout these developments, the Corozzo name slowly traveled up the ladder of law enforcement concern. The brothers' growing prominence did not go entirely unnoticed by the public either, though they were far from household names. Occasional newspaper stories, often buried deep inside the metro section, would mention a Joseph Corozzo or Nicholas Corozzo in connection with gambling raids or investigations into corruption on the waterfront or in local unions. These articles tended to be brief, reliant on police press releases, and devoid of personal detail. To the wider city, they were just more Italian surnames in an endless stream of stories about organized crime. For investigators who tracked patterns over years and decades, they were data points in a slowly emerging picture. It was also during these years that differences in how Italian-American communities perceived organized crime became more sharply defined. Many residents resented the way that every arrest of a suspected mob figure was used to reinforce stereotypes about their entire ethnic group. Community leaders, clergy, and local politicians condemned the mafia as a destructive force that exploited its own neighbors. At the same time, a quieter, more ambivalent sentiment persisted among some, a recognition that, however harmful their methods, men in the underworld sometimes filled gaps left by official institutions, whether by mediating disputes, providing emergency cash, or intervening in situations where the police were distrusted. For someone like Joseph, whose day-to-day dealings straddled that boundary, this ambiguity was both a resource and a constant source of risk. The same neighbor who privately appreciated a favor might, under pressure from investigators or after suffering harm, become a witness. By the end of the 1,970 seconds, the Gambino family structure and operations were under more intense scrutiny than ever before, even if much of that attention was not yet visible to the public. The FBI, through patient surveillance and the cultivation of informants, had begun assembling organizational charts that named Carlo Gambino's successors, including Paul Castellano as boss, Aniello Della Croce as underboss, and a supporting cast of capos and soldiers. Though these charts were imperfect and sometimes outdated, they gave prosecutors a framework for understanding how the family functioned. In several of those internal documents, drawn up in the late 1970 seconds and early 1980 seconds, Joseph Jojo Corozzo appeared not as a peripheral figure, but as an established member of the Gambino hierarchy, associated with specific crews and territories. He had, by that point, accumulated a criminal record that, while not as spectacular as those of some more notorious figures, reinforced his standing in the eyes of law enforcement. Arrests on gambling and related charges, noted in local files, hinted at involvement in the betting operations that remained a bedrock of mafia income. Allegations of loan sharking, even when they did not result in major convictions, fit the pattern that prosecutors would later describe in detail: a network of high-interest lenders backed by the implicit threat of organized retaliation. Through it all, Joseph's public profile remained low. There were no magazine features about him, no photographs splashed across front pages. He was, in many ways, the embodiment of the kind of mid-level mafia figure the old bosses preferred: useful, steady, and largely invisible to anyone outside of law enforcement and his own community. Inside the Gambino family, however, invisibility to the public did not mean insignificance. As the 1980 seconds approached, internal strains that had been building during the Castellano years were nearing a breaking point. Many street-oriented members resented what they saw as Castellano's distance from traditional rackets and his perceived favoritism toward relatives and in-laws involved in more sophisticated financial schemes. Younger figures with ambitions of their own were watching closely, taking the measure of who might support a change in leadership. In this atmosphere, trusted intermediaries, men who knew how to speak to both sides, who understood the pressures on neighborhood crews as well as the boss's expectations, performed a critical function. Joseph Corozzo, with his experience, his family connections, and his reputation for discretion, was well positioned to play that role, even if few outside his world yet knew his name. The choices he had made in the preceding 2 decades to align himself fully with the Gambino organization, to embrace the obligations and risks that came with membership, had set him on a path that would soon intersect with one of the most turbulent chapters in American mafia history. By the closing years of the 1970 seconds, the outlines of Joseph Jojo Corozzo's world had sharpened. What had once been a largely local existence, bounded by a handful of Brooklyn streets and neighborhood clubs, was now explicitly tied, in the eyes of law enforcement, to one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the United States. Internal police and FBI memoranda from that era increasingly placed his name not among the fringe figures who drifted in and out of trouble, but among the men considered steady participants in Gambino family activity. He had by then matured from a young associate into a fully initiated member, and law enforcement sources would later agree that he had reached at least the level of a soldier. In practical terms, that meant he was responsible not only for his own conduct, but also for a small network of associates whose work ultimately fed money and influence up the hierarchy. The late 1970 seconds were a period of quiet tension within the Gambino family. Carlo Gambino's long, cautious rule had ended with his death in 1976, and the transition to Paul Castellano's leadership was not universally welcomed. Castellano, who emphasized business ventures that looked more like corporate crime than the traditional street rackets, was seen by some as too distant from the neighborhoods where the family had grown its power. At the same time, the underboss, Aniello Della Croce, had a strong following among the more traditional street-oriented members. The family officially recognized Castellano as boss, but two cultures coexisted under the same umbrella. Men like Joseph, who spent their days dealing with bookmakers, small business owners, and local union figures, moved within that street culture, even as the leadership talked increasingly of sophisticated schemes and legitimate fronts. Through these years, Joseph's reputation within his sphere was built less on dramatic incidents than on steady presence. Gambling remained a core business for the Gambino family, and prosecutors would later describe how the Corozzo brothers were part of the network that kept those operations running in Brooklyn and Queens. Illegal betting on sports, numbers games, and card rooms in the back of bars or clubs generated cash day after day. Loan sharking complemented these activities. People who fell behind in their gambling debts, or small shopkeepers who needed fast money but had no access to bank credit, often turned to lenders operating with the backing of figures like Joseph. Interest rates were high, payments were expected on time, and behind the polite reminders was the knowledge that these debts were enforced not through courts, but through an informal system in which the Gambino family's reputation for intimidation did much of the work on its own. In this environment, the ability to talk, to persuade, and to keep tempers from boiling over was as valuable as the capacity for threats. Interviews with former mob associates who later turned government witness paint a consistent picture of Joseph as a man who preferred to resolve disputes at a table rather than in the street. He was said to be patient in discussions, willing to listen to both sides of an argument over a debt or a percentage split. This temperament did not make the underlying activities lawful or harmless, but it did make him useful to superiors who wanted problems handled smoothly. Discretion and reliability over many years are what often distinguished a simple street enforcer from someone who could be trusted with broader responsibilities, and those were precisely the qualities that law enforcement would later say Joseph possessed. As the 1980 seconds began, pressure on the mafia nationwide intensified. The Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, passed a decade earlier, was finally beginning to bear fruit. Ambitious prosecutors in New York and Washington saw the mafia not just as a collection of individual crimes, but as a target for sweeping enterprise cases. Wiretaps, bugs placed in social clubs, and confidential informants all contributed to an expanding archive of recordings and testimony. Yet the Gambino family, carefully run and skillful in avoiding publicity under Gambino and early Castellano, remained partly insulated. While other families' bosses were indicted in highly publicized trials, Castellano tried to maintain a low-key profile, spending much of his time at his Staten Island home and entrusting much of the day-to-day street management to subordinates. Inside the family, however, dissatisfaction brewed. Street crews complained that Castellano favored relatives and those involved in his more complex economic ventures, like the meat and construction businesses he controlled, over the traditional earners in gambling and extortion. They resented the way some of his circle, perceived as more distanced from the old neighborhoods, seemed to prosper even as the risks faced by street-level operators increased. Men like John Gotti, a rising figure from Queens with a reputation for audacity, became focal points for this discontent. The underboss, Dela Croce, tried to contain the tension, but his own sympathies lay closer to the street than to Castellano's quasi-corporate style. For Joseph and his brothers, these internal struggles were not abstractions. Decisions made at the top about how money was divided, which enterprises were protected, and whose voices were heard had direct consequences at the crew level. The Corozzo brothers were aligned with the Brooklyn and Queens street faction that felt increasingly sidelined under Castellano. While Joseph's instinct was to keep a low profile and avoid the kind of flashy behavior that drew unwanted attention, he was, by association and by business ties, part of the world in which Gotti's rise was being plotted. Federal agents who reconstructed the Gambino family's internal alignments in the years to come would repeatedly place the Corozzo name among those connected to the faction that ultimately backed Gotti's bid for power. The turning point came in a swift cascade of events in late 1985. In the fall, Paul Castellano was under federal indictment, facing a racketeering case that threatened his control and possibly his freedom. At the same time, Aniello Dela Croce, the underboss and the primary buffer between Castellano and the dissatisfied street crews, was gravely ill. On the 2nd of December 1985, Dela Croce died of cancer, depriving Castellano of a crucial ally and the rank and file of a leader many of them respected more than the boss himself. Within weeks, Castellano himself was dead, shot along with his driver and presumed underboss Thomas Bellotti as they arrived for a meeting at Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan on December 16. The killing, executed on a busy Manhattan street, was shocking not only because of who had been targeted, but because of how public the attack was. No member of the Gambino hierarchy took credit, but federal investigators, and eventually cooperating mob figures, would identify John Gotti as the chief architect of the plot. For the American public, the murder of Castellano and the subsequent ascension of Gotti to boss of the Gambino family in early 1986 were dramatic news events. Newspapers ran front-page photos of the crime scene and, later, of Gotti striding confidently out of courtrooms in expensive suits. He became known as the Dapper Don, and, after winning a series of acquittals in high-profile trials, as the Teflon Don. Television crews camped outside his headquarters at the Ravenite Social Club in Manhattan's Little Italy. To many New Yorkers, organized crime suddenly had a face and a personality. But that face was only the visible tip of a much larger structure. For every highly publicized courtroom appearance by Gotti, there were dozens of quieter meetings in Brooklyn clubs where day-to-day decisions were made by men like Joseph Corozzo, far from the cameras. Gotti's rise altered the internal dynamics of the Gambino family. Those perceived as loyal to Castellano's inner circle found themselves marginalized or worse. Those who had supported Gotti, including several Brooklyn and Queens crews, gained influence. Law enforcement sources later described the Corozzo brothers as beneficiaries of this shift. Without becoming celebrities, they were seen inside the organization as reliable, long-serving figures in the street faction whose interests Gotti championed. In the years following the Castellano killing, FBI charts of the Gambino hierarchy increasingly listed Joseph not merely as a soldier but, by the late 1982, as a captain overseeing his own crew. With that promotion came greater authority over rackets in his territory and a closer relationship with the family's top decision-makers. The Gotti era also brought with it a paradox. On one hand, his flamboyant style and open defiance toward law enforcement energized many lower-level members who had chafed under Castellano's restraint. On the other hand, his public profile drew an intensity of investigative focus that the family had largely avoided under Carlo Gambino. The Ravenite Social Club became one of the most heavily monitored locations in New York. The FBI eventually succeeded in planting listening devices in an upstairs apartment used for private conversations, capturing hours of incriminating discussions. Prosecutors used these recordings, along with testimony from insiders, to build a comprehensive case against Gotti and his close associates. Men like Joseph, who favored operating in the background, had to adapt to a reality in which simply being part of the Gambino leadership meant existing under a permanent cloud of surveillance. Throughout the late 1980s, cooperative witnesses began to peel back the veil on the inner workings of the Gambino family. Some were low-level bookmakers or union functionaries. Others were more significant figures who decided, under the pressure of lengthy prison sentences, to testify for the government. Among the most consequential of these was Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, Gotti's underboss, who agreed in 1991 to cooperate. In marathon debriefing sessions, Gravano walked prosecutors through the family's hierarchy and its business operations, identifying bosses, underbosses, consigliere, capos, and soldiers by name. In these sessions and the court testimony that followed, Joseph "Jojo" Corozzo emerged in the official record not as a marginal figure but as a recognized captain and part of the fabric of Gambino governance. Gravano's accounts, as with any cooperating witness, were not accepted uncritically. Defense attorneys challenged his credibility and motives, but over time, multiple sources, including wiretap transcripts, informants, and other government witnesses, reinforced the core picture he presented. They described Joseph as responsible for supervising gambling and loan sharking in parts of Brooklyn and Queens, and as someone who could be called upon to sit in on meetings when disputes arose between crews or when sensitive messages from higher-ups needed to be relayed. Law enforcement officials came to view him as a man comfortable in the role of an intermediary, combining knowledge of street-level operations with an understanding of the leadership's broader priorities. While these internal accounts were being assembled behind the scenes, the public's attention was fixed on the series of trials that would ultimately bring down Gotti's reign. After beating several earlier cases, he was indicted again in 1990 on federal charges that included murder and racketeering. This time, the prosecution had the benefit not only of extensive wiretap evidence but also of Gravano's cooperation. In 1992, Gotti was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The Teflon Don image collapsed. The message to the remaining leadership of the Gambino family and the other New York families was unmistakable. The era in which bosses could operate with relative impunity was over. For the Gambino organization, Gotti's conviction forced another reorganization. With the boss in prison, the family turned to a combination of acting bosses and an internal administration intended to preserve continuity while avoiding the kind of exposure that had doomed Gotti. Law enforcement sources and later indictments would place Joseph "Jojo" Corozzo among the circle of men whose experience and relationships made them central to that effort. The qualities that had brought him this far: discretion, a talent for mediation, and long-standing ties to both street crews and higher-ranking figures positioned him to play an even more influential role in the post-Gotti era. At the same time, Joseph's own legal troubles were accumulating. The same shift toward aggressive use of racketeering laws that had ensnared Gotti was being applied more broadly to mid-level and senior figures across the mafia. Federal prosecutors were increasingly willing to build cases that ranged over many years, bundling gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and labor racketeering allegations into single indictments. In the early 1992s, Joseph would face such charges himself and ultimately enter a guilty plea in federal court, resulting in a prison sentence that marked a new chapter in his life. That development, however, lay just ahead. As the 1980 seconds gave way to the 1990 seconds, the man who had begun as a quiet neighborhood figure in post-war Brooklyn had become, by almost every account, a key component of the Gambino family's leadership structure, a position that brought both influence within his world and a level of scrutiny from law enforcement that he could not easily escape. The early 1990 seconds opened with a sense of reckoning for New York's underworld. In the space of just a few years, the federal government had done what decades of earlier investigations had failed to achieve. It had taken down the ostensible heads of several major mafia families in highly publicized trials. For the Gambino organization, the turning point came with John Gotti's 1992 conviction on murder and racketeering charges. The man who had embodied a new, media-savvy sort of boss was sentenced to life in prison without parole and shipped off to a high-security federal facility. Officially, Gotti remained the family's boss, but the reality on the street was that an era had ended. Below him, however, the structure did not melt away overnight. The fabric of crews, captains, and intermediaries that had carried out the family's business for decades remained in place, adjusting to new leadership arrangements and renewed law enforcement attention. Joseph "Jojo" Corozzo entered this period as a man well known to investigators, but still largely invisible to the general public. By the time Gotti was convicted, federal agents and New York detectives had him pegged as a Gambino captain, responsible for supervising a crew in Brooklyn and Queens with rackets centered on illegal gambling and loan sharking. His name appeared in internal FBI charts of the family's hierarchy and in the background files that prosecutors compiled as they searched for ways to push beyond the flamboyant boss and into the family's mid and upper management. Tiers, the very qualities that had helped him survive and advance his understated manner. His preference for quiet negotiations over noisy confrontations also made him a challenging target. He was careful with his words in public, cautious about telephones, and rarely seen in settings likely to attract press photographers. The federal strategy in these years was to use the RICO statute to build wide-ranging cases that could reach men like Corozzo. Rather than indicting one bookmaker here, one loan shark there, prosecutors in Brooklyn and Manhattan began assembling indictments that laid out years-long patterns of conduct and tied them to a defined criminal enterprise, the Gambino family itself. Surveillance operations, including wiretaps and hidden microphones, gathered snippets of conversation from social clubs, restaurants, and payphones. Informants, some of them motivated by fear, others by the prospect of reduced sentences, filled in gaps, explaining the significance of names and code words. Financial records, when they could be found, helped corroborate the flow of money. Against this backdrop, the mid-level figures who had once thought themselves insulated by their distance from the family's top tier found that the net was widening. It was in this context that Joseph faced one of the most serious legal challenges of his career. In the early 1992s, federal prosecutors in the Eastern District of New York brought a racketeering case that named him alongside other alleged members and associates of the Gambino organization. The core of the government's allegations centered on illegal gambling and loan sharking rings that had operated for years in Brooklyn and Queens, an underground economy of sports betting, numbers, games, and high-interest loans that, according to the indictment, enriched the defendants while preying on local residents. The charges portrayed a system in which bookmakers took wagers on everything from horse races to football games, passing a share of their proceeds up the chain, while lenders extended credit at rates that could quickly overwhelm borrowers who fell behind. Court filings and contemporaneous news coverage described these activities from the perspective of law enforcement and the people drawn into the scheme's orbit. Small business owners who could not secure bank loans turned instead to lenders backed by the Gambino family's reputation for enforcing obligations outside the law. Gamblers who lost more than they could afford were offered credit that seemed like a temporary reprieve, but often pulled them deeper into debt. When payments lagged, pressure followed. Even when no explicit threat was spoken, the reputation attached to names like Corozzo carried its own weight. In charging documents, prosecutors emphasized this pattern as part of a broader picture of organized extortion, arguing that the power of the Gambino name transformed otherwise private disputes over money into matters of public concern. Faced with evidence gathered over years of investigation and aware of the harsh sentences that full RICO convictions could carry, Joseph eventually chose to plead guilty rather than contest all the charges at trial. His decision echoed that of numerous other mafia figures in the same period, as the calculus shifted from a time when defendants routinely gambled on the possibility of acquittal to one in which the combination of wiretap evidence and insider testimony made the risks of a courtroom fight much higher. In entering a plea, he did not publicly narrate his life story or invite profile writers into his world. He simply accepted the specific criminal responsibility laid out in the agreement. In return, he avoided the maximum penalties he might have faced and received a federal prison sentence measured in years rather than decades. The sentencing itself, reported briefly in local papers and recorded in court transcripts, marked a turning point. For the first time, Joseph, who had previously managed to keep his brushes with the law relatively contained, was now facing an extended period in federal custody. The judge's remarks echoed themes common to mafia prosecutions of the era: a condemnation of the way organized crime siphoned money out of already struggling communities, a warning that the days of quietly tolerated rackets were over, and an assertion that meaningful prison terms were necessary to deter others. Advocates for victims of loan sharking and gambling debts supported this harder line, arguing that the impact of these so-called victimless crimes was anything but abstract. Families were bankrupted, small shops closed, and people who tried to resist often found themselves harassed or worse. Joseph's arrival in the federal prison system placed him in a strange kind of continuity with others from his world. By the early 1992s, federal penitentiaries and medium security facilities held a significant number of men from the New York Mafia families, many of them serving time not for acts of direct violence but for the financial and organizational crimes that kept their enterprises running. Inside, the strict rules of prison life intersected with the informal hierarchies and loyalties that prisoners carried with them. Officially, these men were just numbers in a system. Unofficially, their reputations and relationships still mattered. While details of Joseph's day-to-day life in custody are sparse, he did not conduct interviews or write memoirs. Those who have studied organized crime note that federal prison terms often served as a kind of enforced sabbatical for figures of his rank, a time away from the street during which ties could be maintained through visits and letters, and during which they remained, in many cases, part of the internal calculations of their organizations. On the outside, the Gambino family continued to evolve. With John Gotti locked away and his once feared underboss, Frank Locascio, also serving a life sentence, the family turned to other leaders to coordinate its affairs. Testimony in later trials and statements by the FBI indicated that, throughout the 1,990 seconds, the Gambinos experimented with different arrangements: acting bosses, street bosses, and administrative committees, all designed to keep operations running while minimizing the exposure of any one figure. John Gotti's son, John A. Jr. Gotti, was widely described by law enforcement as an acting boss for part of the decade, overseeing certain aspects of the family's business until his own indictments in the late 1990 seconds and early 2000s. Peter Gotti, John's brother, would emerge later in the decade and into the early 2000s as another central figure. Within this shifting structure, the consigliere's role took on renewed importance. Traditionally, the consigliere served as an advisor and mediator, a counselor to the boss who could offer a perspective somewhat removed from the day-to-day pressures of running crews or enforcing street-level discipline. As bosses and underbosses cycled through indictments, trials, and prison sentences, someone with deep experience and a reputation for level-headedness was particularly valuable in that third seat of the administration. It was in this context that Joseph Jojo Corozzo's name began to appear not just as a captain but, in FBI affidavits and court testimony, as the consigliere of the Gambino family. Law enforcement agents who testified in racketeering trials in the late 1990 seconds and early 2000s laid out charts for juries that placed Joseph in that advisory position alongside a boss and underboss. They described him as the man to whom captains could turn when disputes arose among crews, and as someone who helped transmit decisions from the top to the rank and file. In one high-profile prosecution of Peter Gotti and others, an FBI agent took the stand and explained that, according to informants and surveillance, the Gambino administration in the mid-1990 seconds consisted of John Gotti as boss, even from prison, with an acting boss on the street, Peter Gotti as underboss, and Joseph Jojo Corozzo as consigliere. Defense attorneys disputed the specifics, arguing that the government was overreaching in its interpretations, but the basic outline that Joseph had become part of the family's formal leadership was echoed in multiple cases. By the time he completed his first substantial federal prison term and returned home, This was the role the government believed he either held or was poised to assume. His re-entry into Brooklyn life was quiet. There were no cameras waiting on the sidewalk, no interviews about repentance or defiance. For his neighbors, he was a familiar figure returning from a place many in those communities had seen relatives or acquaintances go. For prosecutors and FBI agents, however, his release was a moment to watch carefully. Would he withdraw from active involvement, content to live on whatever wealth he had accumulated? Or would he step back into the stream of Gambino business, applying his experience to help guide a family that, like its counterparts, was struggling to adapt to a world in which the government had become significantly more adept at penetrating its secrets? Evidence assembled in later investigations suggested that he chose the latter course. Surveillance of Gambino-linked social clubs and restaurants in the late 1992 recorded him meeting periodically with other figures known to law enforcement as captains or senior associates. Informants told their handlers that Joseph was again playing a role in settling disputes and allocating responsibilities among crews. These accounts portrayed a man older and more cautious than in his early days, keenly aware of the dangers of loose talk and public display, but still committed to maintaining the structures that had defined his adult life. Even in an era when many younger people in Italian-American neighborhoods were pursuing careers far removed from the old underworld, there remained a cadre of veteran figures like Joseph who kept the traditional hierarchies alive. At the same time, the social and legal environment around him had changed. Public tolerance for the old romanticized images of the mafia had diminished as more stories emerged about the real toll of its activities. The businesses ruined by extortion, the unions manipulated for private gain, the fear that kept witnesses from coming forward. Law enforcement agencies had refined their tools, integrating financial analysis, long-term undercover work, and sophisticated electronic surveillance. And the mafia itself, while still dangerous, was no longer the unchallenged power it had been in the mid-20th century. Rival criminal organizations, including international drug cartels and homegrown street gangs, had claimed their own territories and markets. Against this backdrop, Joseph's position as consigliere in the late 1992s and early 2000s was both a testament to his longevity and a measure of the Gambino family's determination to preserve its traditional form. He was, in essence, a bridge figure, a man whose formative years had been spent in the tightly knit Brooklyn of the 1942nd and 1952nd, now counseling an organization trying to operate under the near-permanent gaze of federal investigators. His very survival to that point, when so many contemporaries had been killed, imprisoned for life, or turned government witness, spoke to the traits that had long defined him in the eyes of peers and prosecutors alike: caution, an aptitude for negotiation, and an ability to function effectively in an environment where almost every conversation might one day be replayed in a courtroom. That environment would become even more fraught in the years ahead. As the new century began, federal and state authorities launched fresh initiatives aimed at what they now openly called the remnants of the traditional mafia families. For the Gambino organization, this pressure would culminate in one of the largest mass indictments in its history, a case that again placed Joseph Jojo Corozzo at the center of the government's theory of how the family operated. The groundwork for that case: surveillance, informant debriefings, the quiet compilation of years' worth of evidence, was already being laid in the period immediately following his return from his first major prison term. His attempt to resume a role as a behind-the-scenes counselor to the Gambinos would ultimately bring him, once more, into direct confrontation with the institutions of law and justice that had been trying to dismantle the world he inhabited since before he was born. By the early years of the new century, the world Joseph Jojo Corozzo inhabited felt both familiar and strangely altered. The boroughs were still there, the same arteries of streets in Brooklyn and Queens, the same kinds of storefront social clubs and back rooms where men had met for decades. But the larger atmosphere had shifted. The old bosses of Joseph's youth were either long dead or serving life sentences. Younger people in the Italian-American neighborhoods that had once been the mafia's heartland were increasingly moving to the suburbs, going to college, choosing careers in law, business, or technology. At the same time, law enforcement had become far more systematic and far more patient in its pursuit of the remaining underworld hierarchies. It was into this atmosphere that Joseph stepped when he returned from his first long stretch in federal prison in the mid-1990s, and it was this environment that would define the final, most scrutinized phase of his career. When Joseph came home, the Gambino family was in a state of controlled uncertainty. John Gotti was in a federal prison in Illinois, maintaining his claim to the title of boss, but physically removed from the daily give and take that had once been his hallmark. Below him, a series of acting bosses and trusted lieutenants tried to keep the organization steady. Law enforcement sources would later describe a kind of uneasy balancing act in those years. On paper, Gotti still sat at the top. In practice, figures like his brother Peter Gotti and his son John A. Jr. Gotti, as well as experienced captains, handled most of the operational decisions. The family's old rackets, gambling, loan sharking, and control of certain unions and construction contracts continued, but they operated under a shadow that was darker and more constant than in previous decades. In that setting, the quiet skills that had always characterized Joseph's approach took on renewed importance. He was older now, in his 50s, with decades of experience navigating the shifting currents of internal politics and external pressure. According to FBI agents and prosecutors who later summarized their investigations, he resumed not just the role of a captain supervising a crew, but increasingly acted as an advisor and mediator among other senior figures. Informants told their government handlers that Joseph was someone other captains trusted to give them a fair hearing when disputes arose over territory, money, or the behavior of particular associates. His habit of speaking carefully, of avoiding the broad, boastful statements that had so often been caught on tape and used against other mob leaders, made him a natural fit for the position law enforcement would soon attribute to him, consigliere of the Gambino family. Even in this elevated role, the substance of the work remained rooted in the same activities that had defined the family for decades. Illegal gambling evolved with the time. Sports betting increasingly took advantage of offshore phone banks and, later, internet platforms, but the underlying relationships were unchanged. Bookmakers needed protection and favorable credit terms. Gamblers needed someone to take their action, and when they lost, often someone to extend more credit than was wise. Loan sharking stayed steady as well. The need for quick cash among small contractors, shop owners, and individuals willing to sign on to punishing repayment schedules did not disappear with the new millennium. Federal affidavits filed in connection with later cases described a network of betting operations and high-interest loans spread across Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, and beyond, generating regular income for the Gambino hierarchy. Where the environment had changed most dramatically was in the level of scrutiny. Every phone call, every meeting in a known club, every visit to a particular restaurant had to be considered as potentially observed or recorded. The FBI and NYPD, now many years into their specialized campaigns against organized crime, had built detailed maps of which men met where and when. They had wiretapped payphones, planted hidden microphones in club walls, and cultivated informants who could explain the meaning of gestures and half-finished phrases. Italian law enforcement agencies were also increasingly involved, sharing intelligence about the Sicilian connections that had long linked American Cosa Nostra families like the Gambinos to counterparts in Palermo and beyond. One of the most significant developments of this period was the growing recognition, on both sides of the Atlantic, that the Gambino family and Sicilian groups remained intertwined in certain ventures. In the 1980 seconds, the so-called Pizza Connection case had exposed a vast drug trafficking network involving Sicilian mafiosi and American families. By the late 1990 seconds and early 2000s, investigators believed that newer generations of Sicilian bosses were re-establishing commercial ties with the Gambinos in New York, particularly in construction, freight, and other industries where both sides had long-standing footprints. Joint operations between U.S. agencies and Italian police began to quietly target these links, listening, watching and compiling evidence for what they hoped would be a decisive blow. In Brooklyn and Queens, these geopolitical dimensions were largely invisible to the shopkeepers and residents who still saw men like Joseph as local fixtures. To them, he remained a familiar name, an aging neighborhood figure who carried a certain aura that required a mix of respect and caution. When law enforcement later summarized his role in court papers, they emphasized both the symbolic and practical power of that image. A visit or a phone call from someone believed to speak for the Gambino administration, they argued, could persuade people to make payments or decisions they might otherwise resist, even without explicit mention of physical harm. Defense attorneys, for their part, would point out that public perception and rumor often inflated the influence of such figures beyond what could be proven in a courtroom. Between those two poles, the feared consigliere of government charts and the unassuming older man known to neighbors, lay the contested reality that trials and pleas attempted to pin down. Throughout the late 1992s and into the early 2000s, Joseph's name surfaced periodically in indictments and investigative reporting, typically as one among several defendants in broad racketeering cases. One significant set of charges, brought in the mid-1992s, had already sent him to prison for a time on gambling and extortion-related counts. After his release, he faced additional legal skirmishes as prosecutors continued to target what they described as the Gambino leadership's efforts to maintain control over certain unions and construction projects. Some of these cases ended in dismissals or lesser pleas. Others resulted in additional supervised release terms or shorter custodial sentences. None, however, fully removed him from the government's picture of how the family functioned. Those pictures grew more detailed as the decade progressed. In multiple prosecutions of other Gambino figures, most notably those against Peter Gotti and his alleged administration, FBI agents took the stand with organizational charts that put Joseph at or near the position of consigliere. They walked juries through step-by-step explanations of how they believed the family divided responsibilities. A boss or acting boss making final decisions, an underboss overseeing enforcement and day-to-day operations, and a consigliere providing counsel and helping to handle particularly sensitive disputes. The charts also identified captains, including men related to Joseph by blood, such as his brother Nicholas, Little Nick Corozzo, as well as longtime colleagues from their Brooklyn days. In one trial, an agent described Joseph as someone who served as a mediator and advisor, a phrase that would be quoted in multiple press accounts. Defense lawyers, aware of how damaging such labels could be in the eyes of jurors, argued that the government was treating rumor and the self-serving statements of informants as established fact. They pointed out that organizational charts were only as accurate as the intelligence that underlay them, and that in a world built on secrecy and shifting alliances, any outsider's model would necessarily be an approximation. Yet even as they made these arguments, additional pieces of evidence accumulated: records of meetings, surveillance photographs, intercepted phone calls in which other suspected members referred to Joseph with deference that suggested more than a routine relationship. Away from the courtroom, the economic and social landscape that had given rise to the traditional mafia was eroding. Globalization, new technologies, and demographic shifts were undermining the old monopolies and leverage points. Container ports were increasingly automated, limiting the human choke points through which dock workers and stevedore unions had once controlled access to the waterfront. The rise of corporate security departments and compliance programs made it harder, though by no means impossible, for organized crime to influence big construction projects or city contracts. Younger union members, less tied to neighborhood loyalties and more aware of legal risks, were sometimes less receptive to pressure from traditional mob-linked figures. For men of Joseph's generation, this posed a stark challenge: adapt or fade. Some chose a quieter life, stepping back from active involvement or relocating away from their old neighborhoods. Others, including many of those identified by law enforcement as the Gambino administration, tried to adjust tactics while preserving the essential structure of the enterprise. Illegal gambling moved into more clandestine channels, exploiting technological anonymity. Extortion and influence in unions and construction shifted toward more subtle methods. Pressure via intermediaries, carefully structured consulting relationships, and informal understandings rather than overt threats. From the government's perspective, this evolution made cases more complex but also underscored why they believed it was necessary to target the leadership layer, including consigliere figures like Joseph, rather than focusing solely on street-level operators. All the while, a long-term, multinational investigation was quietly assembling what would later be unveiled as one of the largest single blows ever struck against the Gambino family. Initiated in the late 1992 and developed over nearly a decade, this project involved coordination between the FBI, the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District of New York, Italian law enforcement agencies, and various state and local partners. In wire rooms on both sides of the Atlantic, agents listened as suspects spoke in coded phrases about business, debts, and friends overseas. Surveillance teams watched as couriers moved between meetings in Brooklyn clubs and counterparts in Sicily and Calabria. Informants in both countries, motivated by a mixture of fear, resentment, and the promise of reduced sentences, provided context that helped translate garbled conversations into usable evidence. For Joseph, these years unfolded mostly out of public view. Unlike his former boss John Gotti, he did not grant interviews, flaunt designer suits, or taunt prosecutors on the courthouse steps. His presence in the press was intermittent and low-key, his name appearing in lists of indicted defendants, his photograph, when available, showing an aging man in plain clothes, arriving at or leaving a courthouse. There were no magazine profiles trying to psychoanalyze him, no television specials breathlessly tracking his every move. Yet within law enforcement circles, he was increasingly seen as a linchpin of what remained of the traditional Gambino leadership, someone whose removal would send a signal that the old order was truly under siege. That signal arrived in February 2008, in a pre-dawn sweep that played out in apartment buildings, private homes, and businesses across the New York area. Teams of FBI agents and NYPD officers executed arrest warrants on dozens of suspected Gambino members and associates. Similar raids took place in Italy, as part of the same coordinated operation. By the end of the day, federal officials announced that they had charged more than 60 individuals in a massive racketeering case. The indictment ran to hundreds of pages, detailing allegations that spanned decades, from illegal gambling and extortion to labor racketeering and, in some instances, violence connected to internal power struggles and disputes over money. At the center of this sweeping document were the names of men the government described as the current administration of the Gambino family. Among them was Joseph Jojo Corozzo, identified explicitly as the family's consigliere. Alongside him were listed an acting boss, an underboss, and several captains, including his brother Nicholas. The charges tied Joseph primarily to gambling and extortion conspiracies, portraying him as one of the senior figures who oversaw and profited from these activities, rather than as someone personally present at every individual transaction. Prosecutors argued that his long participation in the enterprise and his advisory role made him criminally responsible for the pattern of racketeering they described. For the first time, Joseph's alleged status as consigliere was not just a matter of internal FBI charts or agent testimony in other people's trials. It was front and center, in a major indictment announced at a widely covered press conference. Reporters who had followed organized crime for years recognized the significance. While previous cases had chipped away at the Gambino leadership, this operation aimed to decapitate what the government saw as the family's entire governing structure in one coordinated strike. U.S. officials emphasized that the case reflected not only local investigative work, but also nearly a decade of cooperation with Italian authorities, underscoring the globalized nature of the networks they believed they were confronting. Neighbors in the Brooklyn communities where Joseph had spent much of his life awoke to see television trucks parked outside familiar buildings, their cameras trained on doorways where agents had earlier escorted handcuffed figures into waiting vehicles. Some expressed surprise that an older man they knew from the neighborhood was being portrayed on the news as a key mafia advisor. Others shrugged, saying that rumors about his life had circulated for years. Civil rights advocates, while often supportive of efforts to curb organized crime, also raised concerns about the breadth of RICO indictments and the potential for overreach when prosecutors tried to tie individual defendants to long histories of alleged wrongdoing based on membership rather than direct actions. For Joseph himself, the 2008 indictment marked the culmination of a trajectory that had begun in the narrow streets of post-war Brooklyn and led, through a lifetime of quiet involvement in the Gambino world, to a spot at the center of one of the most ambitious anti-mafia cases in American history. The years ahead would see him once again navigating the federal court system, weighing legal options, and facing the possibility of another substantial prison term. But in that February moment, as the charges were unsealed, and the phrase "Gambino consigliere" echoed in newspapers and on television broadcasts, the story of how a boy from a crowded Italian-American household had grown into a man regarded by law enforcement as a principal strategist of an aging, but still potent criminal enterprise came fully into public view. When the arrests in February 2008 jolted New York awake, the spectacle carried a sense of finality. Television cameras captured agents and FBI windbreakers, leading older men out of modest houses and apartment buildings, their hands cuffed behind their backs. In press conferences later that day, U.S. officials spoke of dismantling what they described as the current leadership of the Gambino crime family. The indictment they unsealed did not read like the script of a single dramatic episode, but like a ledger of decades of alleged activity. Bookmaking operations that had quietly taken bets from thousands of New Yorkers, loans extended at crushing interest, and pressures exerted in union halls and on construction sites where the Gambinos had long held sway. Near the top of that document, now for all to see, was the name Joseph Jojo Corozzo, identified unmistakably as the family's consigliere. In the days immediately after his arrest, Joseph found himself in a world he knew all too well. Federal holding cells, preliminary appearances before a magistrate judge, and legal arguments over bail and detention. Prosecutors in the Eastern District of New York argued that his role in the alleged enterprise, combined with a history of prior racketeering-related convictions, made him both a danger to the community and a likely participant in any effort to interfere with witnesses or ongoing investigations. They cited informant testimony and surveillance suggesting that, even in his mid-60s, he had remained active in overseeing gambling and extortion schemes, and that his alleged position as consigliere gave him special importance in the family's hierarchy. Defense counsel painted a different picture. They emphasized his age, his health issues, and the non-violent character of the charges then pending against him. They argued that the government was leaning heavily on the power of labels, consigliere, administration, to inflate their case in the eyes of the public and the court, while the actual conduct attributed to their client boiled down to participation in betting operations and financial pressure disputes, serious but far removed, they stressed, from the blood-soaked tales that had long dominated mafia mythology. Bail hearings in such cases are rarely about truth in a broad sense. They are about risk and trust. After weighing the arguments, the court imposed conditions that reflected both sides of the equation: strict monitoring, limits on travel, and financial assurances meant to guarantee his appearance at future proceedings, but no immediate return to a normal, unobserved life. While these legal skirmishes played out, the full scope of the 2008 case, quickly dubbed Operation Old Bridge by authorities, became clearer. The name was a pointed reference to the operation's transatlantic reach. For years, U.S. and Italian investigators had been listening, following, and quietly making arrests on both sides of the ocean, trying to map the business ties between the Gambinos in New York and powerful clans in Sicily. Italian police simultaneously unsealed their own set of charges against alleged Sicilian mafiosi, whom they accused of coordinating with the Gambinos on construction and logistics ventures. The Old Bridge of the title was the historic, often familial connection between Sicilian and American criminal organizations links that had first been forged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and which, investigators argued, remained active a century later. The American indictment alleged that Joseph and his co-defendants were part of a racketeering conspiracy that had run from the late 1982 through the 2000s. It charged that gambling operations under Gambino protection took in millions of dollars in wagers, and that loan sharking activity, some of it tied directly to those gambling debts, generated a steady stream of income for the family's leadership. The charges also referenced labor-related schemes, efforts, prosecutors said, to influence which companies received certain contracts and how union locals handled labor disputes, all in ways that benefited companies willing to cooperate with the Gambinos' demands. In public statements, federal officials took pains to describe not only the alleged illegal activities, but their social impact. Small business owners pushed into financial corners, legitimate contractors squeezed out of bids, and union members whose representation was compromised by hidden pressures. For those caught up in the case, the months that followed were a study in attrition. Dozens of defendants, each with their own past convictions and personal calculations, had to decide whether to fight at trial or accept plea agreements that would almost certainly send them to prison but would also cap their potential exposure. The Mafia's old code of silence had been under strain for decades. By the 2000s, the number of former insiders willing to cooperate with the government had grown markedly. Some in the 2008 case chose that path, becoming witnesses whose statements would form part of the prosecution's foundation. Others, including seasoned figures who had already spent years in prison, declined cooperation but quietly entered guilty pleas on selected counts. Joseph was among the latter group, with a prior federal racketeering conviction already on his record, and the government prepared to present evidence from wiretaps, surveillance, and cooperating witnesses. The risks of taking the 2008 case to a full jury trial were considerable. Racketeering statutes allowed prosecutors to tie his alleged position in the Gambino hierarchy to a wide range of criminal activity, even acts in which he had played no direct part, so long as they could show he had agreed to participate in the overall enterprise. Defense attorneys could challenge individual pieces of evidence, question the credibility of informants, and argue that the government was over-interpreting coded or fragmentary conversations. But the broader trend in such cases since the 1982 was sobering. When racketeering indictments against major mafia figures went to trial, the government increasingly won. In this climate, Joseph ultimately chose to plead guilty to a racketeering conspiracy charge. In doing so, he accepted legal responsibility for participating in an enterprise whose core activities, as outlined in the plea, involved illegal gambling and extortion. The mechanics of the plea hearing were, in many ways, routine. Standing beside his lawyers in a federal courtroom, he answered the judge's questions in a low voice, confirming that he understood the rights he was waiving and the potential penalties he faced. He provided the brief factual admission required to support a guilty plea under federal rules, acknowledging his involvement in the enterprise's conduct, but he did not offer any sweeping confessions or commentary on his life. Like many in his position, he seemed intent on saying only what was legally necessary, nothing more. The plea did not end the story. It merely shifted the focus to sentencing. Under federal guidelines, the recommended sentence in a racketeering case depends on a complex calculation that takes into account the nature of the offenses, the defendant's role in the enterprise, the amount of money involved, and their prior criminal history. Prosecutors in Joseph's case argued that his alleged status as consigliere and the longevity of his involvement justified a significant term of imprisonment. They pointed to decades of investigations in which his name had surfaced, to prior convictions related to similar conduct, and to the message they believed a serious sentence would send not only to the Gambinos but to other organized crime figures who might otherwise see leadership roles as shields from meaningful punishment. The defense countered with arguments aimed at mitigation. They emphasized that the charges against Joseph, both in the current case and in most of his criminal history, were tied to financial and organizational crimes rather than direct physical harm. They cited his age, well into his 60s by the time of sentencing, and health as reasons for the court to show some leniency. They argued that a lengthy term would, in practical terms, function as an effective life sentence and was not necessary to protect the public, especially in a climate where the traditional mafia's power was already in steep decline. Supporters submitted letters attesting to other sides of his life: his roles as a father, grandfather, or community member, the everyday interactions that rarely make it into prosecution memos or media reports. When the sentence was finally imposed, it reflected a balance, albeit one more favorable to the government's view than the defense's. The court ordered Joseph to serve a term of federal imprisonment measured in years rather than months, along with a period of supervised release and financial penalties. Public reports at the time noted that his sentence fell in the range of roughly 4 years, a substantial punishment given his age and the fact that he had already previously served time for racketeering. For federal officials, it was a concrete demonstration that even the quieter, more insulated figures in the mafia's leadership could be made to face real prison time. For Joseph and his family, it meant another stark separation, another set of holidays and milestones observed through telephone calls and visits in institutional visiting rooms. The reactions to his sentencing mirrored the competing narratives that had surrounded his case from the start. Law enforcement representatives framed the outcome as a significant step in their multi-decade campaign to dismantle the traditional mafia. They noted that the 2008 operation had not only netted dozens of alleged Gambino members and associates, but it also resulted in convictions or guilty pleas from men they identified as the acting boss, underboss, and consigliere positions that, in the classic Cosa Nostra structure, formed the core of decision-making authority. Organized crime researchers pointed to the case as evidence that, while the mafia's influence had waned compared to mid-20th century levels, it still existed in recognizable form, with many of the same titles and internal roles. Civil libertarians and some community advocates, while not defending the underlying conduct, remained wary of the continued expansion of racketeering law. They questioned whether attaching sweeping labels like consigliere might sometimes obscure the need for precise, individualized proof of responsibility. They worried about the potential for guilt by association in cases where the line between knowledge of an enterprise's crimes and meaningful participation in them could blur. In Joseph's case, however, those concerns were partially mooted by his own decision to plead guilty. Whatever debates might be had about the exact contours of his role, he had, in a legal sense, accepted the government's framing of his involvement. For Joseph himself, the return to federal prison in his late 60s marked a sobering new phase. In earlier decades, sentences of a few years had been survivable interludes in the careers of organized crime figures, time served with the expectation of eventual release into largely unchanged neighborhoods. By the 2010 seconds, that expectation no longer held. The world outside the fences was changing at a pace that men of his generation often found bewildering. Technology had transformed how people communicated, bet, and borrowed money. Law enforcement's focus, while still attentive to organized crime, had broadened dramatically after the 11th of September 2001 attacks, with counterterrorism taking priority for resources and attention. Younger Italians in New York were increasingly distant from the insulated, cohesive neighborhoods of the mid-20th century that had sustained the mafia's recruitment and protection. Within prison, Joseph encountered an institutionally structured environment overlaid with the subtle, unofficial hierarchies that inmates import from their prior lives. Men known to have held positions in organized crime could still command a certain deference from some fellow prisoners, but they were now just one set of actors among many, members of street gangs, drug organizations, and extremist groups whose own networks extended far beyond New York's 5 families. Scholars who have interviewed former mafia members describe these later life sentences as particularly disorienting. The status and routines that had once structured their days on the outside meetings in social clubs, negotiations over debts, the constant informal calculations about risk and reputation were replaced by the rigid timetables and impersonal rules of federal corrections. Yet even behind bars, men like Joseph seldom vanished from law enforcement's strategic thinking. FBI organized crime squads and federal prosecutors tracked release dates, monitored communications where legally permitted, and listened for any sign that imprisoned leaders were trying to exert influence over ongoing operations. The very fact of Joseph's plea and sentence, combined with his age, led some analysts to predict that his active role in Gambino affairs would effectively end with this prison term. Others were more cautious, noting that the mafia had a long history of leadership from behind walls, whether through coded messages relayed by lawyers and visitors, or through successors who carried out policies in keeping with an imprisoned mentor's known preferences. On the street, the impact of the 2008 case was both immediate and gradual. In the short term, the removal of so many experienced figures created openings and uncertainty. Some long-standing gambling and loan sharking operations were disrupted, at least temporarily, as new intermediaries tried to establish their credibility. Union locals that had been subject to hidden pressures found themselves the focus of reform efforts, often under the watchful eye of court-appointed monitors. In the longer term, the case contributed to a cumulative weakening of the Gambino family's grip on many of its traditional revenue streams. Other criminal groups moved into spaces the Gambinos had once dominated. Legitimate businesses and unions, emboldened by the visible decline of the old guard, sometimes resisted in ways that would have been unthinkable in earlier decades. For the Italian-American communities that had formed the backdrop of Joseph's life, the case and his sentence were another reminder of a complicated legacy. On one level, many residents were relieved to see the continuing erosion of an underworld that had long exploited its own neighborhoods. On another, they bristled at the way headlines once again linked their ethnicity to organized crime. Joseph's story embodied that tension. He had grown up in the dense, working-class Brooklyn of the 1942nd and 1952nd, a place where mutual aid and neighborhood solidarity often rubbed shoulders with illegal but deeply rooted forms of protection and dispute resolution. Over decades, he had chosen to align himself with the Gambino family, rising, in the eyes of law enforcement, to the role of consigliere. Now, in a federal prison far from those streets, he was living out the consequences of those choices in a world that bore little resemblance to the one in which they had first been made. As his sentence unfolded, observers of organized crime debated what his case signified. Some saw it as the closing of a circle that had begun when Joseph was a teenager watching headlines about Appalachian and the Kefauver hearings, a lifetime bookended by major government crackdowns on institutionally entrenched mafia power. Others viewed it as part of a more complex transition in which one form of organized crime, ethnically defined, hierarchically structured, bound by an old world code, was being replaced not by law-abiding order, but by newer, more fluid criminal networks. In that analysis, Joseph's final encounter with the justice system was less a singular drama than one recognizable chapter in a longer story about how societies respond over time to groups that seek power and profit outside the law. When he eventually approached the end of his 2008 sentence, the questions that had hovered around him for years returned in slightly different form. Would he step quietly into a private life, his influence blunted by age, surveillance, and the steady attrition of his peers? Or would he, in some fashion, remain a reference point within a shrinking world of traditional mafia figures, a man whose name still carried weight in certain circles, even as the wider city moved on? The answer would unfold only gradually, against a backdrop of continuing investigations, shifting alliances, and the inexorable march of time that was thinning the ranks of the generation that had come of age in the shadow of Carlo Gambino's era. When Joseph Jojo Corozzo walked back out of federal custody in the early 2010 seconds, the city he returned to was both recognizably his and subtly foreign. The contours of Brooklyn were the same, the familiar lines of row houses and corner storefronts, but the social fabric that had first drawn him into the underworld decades earlier had thinned and frayed. The tightly knit Italian-American enclaves of his youth were now more diverse. Their children and grandchildren had scattered to Staten Island, New Jersey, Long Island, and far beyond. Many of the storefront social clubs that had once doubled as informal offices for men like him were shuttered, replaced by cafes, small restaurants, or left vacant. Yet for law enforcement, his release was not a mere curiosity. Even in his 70s, Joseph remained, In the eyes of the FBI and federal prosecutors, a symbol and potential focal point of what was left of the Gambino crime family's old guard. His return to civilian life was governed by the conditions of supervised release that accompany most federal sentences. Those terms standard for many defendants, but freighted with particular significance in organized crime cases, typically limited association with convicted felons, restricted travel, and required regular check-ins with probation officers. For someone whose adult life had been built around a network of men with criminal records and reputations, simply abiding by those rules would have been a complex logistical challenge. The names and faces that had filled FBI charts for decades were not just organizational labels, they were, in many instances, relatives, lifelong friends and neighbors. The barrier between personal and professional contact, always thin in the world he had inhabited, became even harder to draw when every phone call or chance meeting risked being interpreted as a violation. Publicly, little is known about the details of Joseph's day-to-day existence after this release. He did not write a memoir, grant interviews, or become a public commentator on his own past. There are no filmed confessions or reflective monologues to provide insight into his private thoughts about aging, regret, or loyalty. What does exist in the public record are the familiar traces that accompany any figure who has been watched for so long. Scattered mentions in court papers, occasional references in news stories about broader mafia trends, and the quiet, bureaucratic notations of the federal court system as probation terms were set, modified, or expired. From these, historians and crime reporters can infer only the broad outlines, that he complied sufficiently with supervision to avoid immediate re-incarceration, that he did not become the central figure in any new publicly announced investigations, and that, as far as official records show, his final years in the orbit of federal scrutiny were comparatively uneventful. The world around him, however, continued to change. In the early 2010 seconds, law enforcement analysts widely noted that the traditional Italian-American mafia in New York, while still present, was a diminished force compared with its mid-20th century peak. The Gambino family, once described by federal officials as the most powerful of the city's 5 families, had been hit repeatedly by indictments over the prior 3 decades. New leadership emerged, often more reserved and less publicly visible than John Gotti, but always operating in an environment where even modest conversations could be subject to surveillance. In 2011, reports in the press and statements in court described Domenico Cefalù, a Sicilian-born figure long associated with the Gambinos, as the family's new boss, another sign of the shifting internal dynamics and of the enduring transatlantic connections that cases like Operation Old Bridge had highlighted. If Joseph played any formal role in these rearrangements, it did not appear in the way his earlier positions had, as a named administrator in major indictments. Instead, his name surfaced less frequently. When it did, it was often as a reference point, a way to anchor a story about the old days of the Gambino administration, or to explain the family ties and mentorship chains that link newer defendants to older generations. Journalists noted, for example, that several men charged in 2010 seconds cases were either blood relatives of longtime figures like Joseph and his brother Nicholas, or had started their criminal careers in crews run by that older cohort. In this sense, Joseph's legacy within the Gambino world extended beyond his own actions. He was part of the milieu that had shaped the men who came after him. As the years passed, the sheer passage of time performed a kind of attrition that no indictment could match. Many of Joseph's contemporaries died, either in prison or in retirement, from the ordinary causes that eventually claim anyone who lives into old age. Others, faced with long sentences and deteriorating health, decided in their final years to cooperate with law enforcement, adding new layers of detail to the historical record about life inside the Gambino family during the decades when Joseph had been active. These late-in-life cooperators did not generally focus their stories on him. He had never been the kind of boss whose every word commanded attention, but their accounts reinforced the broad picture of his role. A steady, low-profile administrator who had excelled at managing gambling and loan sharking operations and at keeping internal disputes from flaring into crises. Outside the narrow world of organized crime, The broader culture continued to both mythologize and scrutinize the mafia. Television series and films revisited familiar tropes: the conflicted mobster, the loyal consigliere, the tension between family life and criminal duty. Historians and sociologists countered with books and articles that tried to demystify these narratives, emphasizing the harm that organized crime inflicted on working-class communities and the ways in which its romanticized image obscured the realities of debt, intimidation, and corrupted institutions. In many of these discussions, Joseph's name appeared not as a central protagonist but as a useful case study, an example of the kind of quiet, managerial figure who kept operations running, while more flamboyant men drew the public eye. One theme that scholars returned to repeatedly was the gap between pop culture depictions of a consigliere and the role that figures like Joseph played in real life. The cinematic model embodied in fictional characters, remembered for calm wisdom and almost lawyerly detachment, only partially overlapped with reality. In the Gambino family, as law enforcement described it, the consigliere was indeed a counselor and mediator, but he was also deeply embedded in the enterprise's commercial activities. He helped to allocate gambling territories, approved or disapproved of new ventures, and weighed in on the resolution of disputes over debts or shares of illegal profits. The title conferred both prestige and responsibility for the financial machinery that underpinned the organization's power. When prosecutors in 2008 and 2009 emphasized Joseph's status as consigliere, they were not simply invoking an exotic Italian term. They were identifying him as one of the core managers of the family's illegal business model. For Italian-American communities, grappling with the legacy of men like Joseph was a complicated task. Activists, educators, and community leaders had long worked to separate ethnicity from organized crime in the public imagination, emphasizing the countless individuals of Italian descent who had contributed to civic life, the arts, academia, and business without any connection to the underworld. At the same time, they could not simply pretend that the mafia had not existed in certain neighborhoods, or that figures like the Corozzo brothers had not wielded real influence for decades. As the older generation of mobsters aged and disappeared from active life, some community organizations seized the moment to expand youth programs, mentorship initiatives, and educational outreach, hoping to ensure that the conditions that had once made the mafia seem like an attractive or inevitable path for some young men would not be recreated. Within law enforcement circles, Joseph's story became part of a larger analytical narrative about the life cycle of traditional organized crime families. Analysts noted that the Gambino family and the others in New York had proven more resilient than some had expected in the 1,980 seconds when the first major RICO trials gave rise to predictions that Cosa Nostra was on the verge of extinction. Instead, the families had adapted, thinning their ranks, consolidating operations, and focusing on lower-profile, often more financialized schemes. Figures like Joseph represented a transitional generation, men who had come of age in the heyday of street-corner social clubs and overt neighborhood control, but who had spent the latter part of their careers navigating an environment of near-eye constant surveillance and shrinking opportunities. By the mid-2010 seconds, much of the public conversation about organized crime had shifted to other threats: transnational drug cartels, cybercrime rings, human trafficking networks, and homegrown gangs with looser, more fluid structures than the rigid hierarchies of the mafia. In that landscape, the Gambino family was often described as a shadow of its former self. Yet the occasional major case, such as the 2019 murder of reputed Gambino boss Francesco "Frankie Boy" Cali outside his Staten Island home, reminded observers that the family still existed and that internal tensions and external conflicts could still erupt into headline-grabbing events. When those stories broke, reporters sometimes mentioned Joseph's name in passing, as part of the lineage of past Gambino leadership, a reminder that the world now flashing across the news ticker was connected to one he had helped shape, even if he was no longer a central actor. The later years of Joseph's life also intersected with shifting attitudes in the criminal justice system toward aging prisoners and ex-offenders. Across the United States, debates intensified over mass incarceration, the cost of imprisoning elderly inmates, and the goals of punishment for people who, by virtue of age and health, posed limited ongoing physical danger. Some advocates argued for expanded compassionate release programs and re-entry support, even for those convicted of serious offenses. Others maintained that figures convicted under racketeering statutes, particularly those who had held leadership positions in harmful enterprises, should not benefit from such leniency. Joseph's own release, achieved through the normal mechanisms of sentence calculation and good time credits rather than any special clemency, nonetheless took place in a climate where the question of what society owes to and expects from people who have spent decades in and around prison was being asked with new urgency. In the absence of public statements from Joseph himself, any attempt to describe his internal reckoning during this period would be speculative. What can be said, based on the available record, is that he remained consistent in certain outward respects. Unlike an increasing number of former mob figures, he did not break his silence to cooperate with the government or to write a tell-you-all account of his life. That choice aligned him with a dwindling subset of his generation who adhered, at least outwardly, to the old code of non-cooperation, accepting prison terms and legal restrictions without offering public justification or confession. To some within the residual mafia culture, such men were praised as stand-up figures. To prosecutors and victims, the same silence read as a refusal to fully acknowledge responsibility for the harm that the enterprise had caused. The contrast between these perspectives underscores a central tension in how Joseph Corozzo's life is interpreted. On one hand are the official documents, indictments, plea agreements, sentencing transcripts, and investigative reports that lay out, in the dry language of law, the government's view of his role in sustaining illegal gambling, extortion, and labor racketeering over many years. On the other are the informal, often oral histories that circulate in neighborhoods and within criminal circles. Stories of favors granted, disputes settled, or, conversely, opportunities blocked and debts enforced. Bridging these two bodies of narrative is the task of historians and serious journalists who must weigh self-serving myths, both from organized crime and from its pursuers, against corroborated facts. For those scholars, Joseph's trajectory offers a useful lens on broader patterns. His early life, rooted in a working-class Italian-American Brooklyn where the mafia's influence was both pervasive and often unspoken, exemplifies the social conditions that helped organized crime take root. Economic insecurity, limited legitimate opportunities, and a distrust of formal institutions that made informal power brokers attractive alternatives. His rise within the Gambino family, as reconstructed by law enforcement and cooperating witnesses, illustrates how responsibility and influence were accumulated less through theatrical violence than through patient management of money flows, disputes, and relationships. His multiple convictions under racketeering statutes mark the maturation of the legal tools used to confront Cosa Nostra, and his lady life experiences aging under supervision in a world where the mafia had lost much of its former sway, highlight the inevitable disconnect between the old structures and the 21st century environment in which they persist in the lied and you first diminished form. In the end, the public record of Joseph "Jojo" Corozzo's later years is, by design, sparse. He did not seek the spotlight, and by the time he exited his final prison term, the era when mafia figures could reliably command national attention had largely passed. He became in many ways what the bosses of his youth had always counseled their men to be: a shadow in the background, a name known to specialists and to those who shared his world, but increasingly unfamiliar to the broader public. Yet the imprint of his choices remains visible in the legal precedents his cases helped to shape, in the internal histories of the Gambino family, and in the ongoing efforts of communities and institutions to come to terms with the legacy of organized crime. As he aged into the status of an elder statesman of a fading order, the tension between the world that had made him and the one that had finally constrained him became ever more stark. a tension that would frame any final assessment of his life and times. As the second decade of the 21st century unfolded, the figure of Joseph "Jojo" Corozzo gradually slipped from the front lines of law enforcement concern into the more ambiguous realm of legacy. He had served his most recent federal sentence, completed his supervised release, and so far as public records show, did what the old-timers always said a wise man should do in old age. He kept his head down. No new high-profile indictments bore his name. No tell-all books or televised interviews surfaced to illuminate his inner world. For a man whose adult life had been spent inside an organization built on secrecy, that final retreat into relative obscurity was fitting. Yet even as his personal story grew quieter, the imprint of his career remained visible in the files of prosecutors, the testimonies of former associates, and the analytic work of historians trying to understand what his life said about the rise and decline of the American mafia. Seen from a distance, the arc of his years maps almost perfectly onto the modern history of organized crime in New York. Born in 1942 into a working-class Italian-American family in Brooklyn, he came of age just as the five families were consolidating their dominance under leaders like Carlo Gambino. As a young man, he moved from the periphery of neighborhood social clubs into the inner circles of the Gambino organization, first as an associate handling local gambling and lending, then as a soldier, and eventually, in the assessment of law enforcement and cooperating witnesses, as a captain and consigliere. His story traces the transformation of the mafia from a loose constellation of neighborhood toughs into a complex, hierarchically managed enterprise that operated illegal businesses on a staggering scale, while also infiltrating unions, construction, and other legitimate industries. At each stage, his trajectory intersected with broader changes in American society. The Brooklyn of his youth offered limited legitimate paths upward for many young men in his position. Overcrowded schools, unstable industrial jobs, and a sometimes distrustful relationship with police and city authorities. In that environment, the local men of respect who could arrange jobs, loans, or protection presented themselves as practical problem solvers. Over time, Joseph chose to align himself with that informal system of power, accepting its rules of loyalty, silence, and obedience in exchange for status and a share of its profits. In doing so, he became part of a structure that did not simply coexist with the legal economy but sought to redirect and exploit it. Law enforcement's understanding of that structure evolved in parallel with his rise. In the 1950 seconds and early 1960 seconds, when he was still a teenager and then a young adult, official knowledge of the mafia was hazy and contested. Local detectives might know the names of certain neighborhood figures and their hangouts, but there was still public debate over whether a coordinated national organization even existed. By the time Joseph had firmly established himself as a Gambino soldier, federal investigators had embraced the concept of Cosa Nostra as a coherent enterprise. The passage of racketeering laws in 1970 gave them a new legal framework that allowed them to treat repeated patterns of gambling, loan sharking, and extortion not as isolated offenses but as facets of a single, ongoing conspiracy. In that new legal landscape, men like Joseph Medu and upper-level managers, who kept the machine running without necessarily drawing attention through spectacular violence, became prime targets. His own legal record illustrates this shift. Early in his career, brushes with the law were relatively contained. Gambling or related charges that produced fines or short stints in custody. As RICO prosecutions ramped up in the 1980 seconds and 1990 seconds, he found himself facing sweeping indictments that reached back over years of activity, aggregating bets taken, loans extended, and pressures applied into a single narrative of racketeering conspiracy. Guilty pleas in those cases led to substantial federal sentences that removed him from the street for extended periods and formally branded him, in the language of the courts, as a repeat participant in organized criminal enterprise. At the same time, his public persona remained almost deliberately nondescript. Unlike John Gotti, whose tailored suits and easy relationship with cameras turned him into an unwitting celebrity, Joseph rarely appeared in the spotlight except as a name in court papers, or as a figure caught briefly by news photographers entering or leaving a courthouse. This low profile was no accident. Within the Gambino family, as law enforcement and later witnesses described it, he was valued precisely for his ability to work behind the scenes, to mediate disputes between crews, to oversee the flow of money from betting parlors and loan sharking operations, and to advise on sensitive questions without creating unnecessary noise. The same traits that made him useful to his superiors made him a more difficult subject for public storytelling. There were few theatrical moments to seize on, few quotable outbursts to replay on the evening news. Yet the harm associated with the activities he helped manage was anything but subtle. Illegal gambling, often dismissed in casual conversation as a harmless vice, left many individuals and families in severe financial distress. Bettors who lost more than they could afford frequently turned to the very loan sharking networks tied to the same organizations that took their wagers, locking themselves into cycles of high-interest debt from which it was difficult to escape. Small business owners, pressured to accept such loans or to make regular payments in exchange for the promise of peace, found their margins eroded and their independence compromised. In construction and union contexts, the kind of labor racketeering and bid-rigging schemes associated with the Gambino's distorted markets drove up costs for taxpayers and undermined the bargaining power of workers, whose dues sometimes ended up in the pockets of corrupt officials and their criminal partners. Community perceptions of figures like Joseph were often conflicted. To some neighbors, particularly those who had benefited from a favor, help with a bill, a job lead, an intervention in a dispute, he could appear as a benevolent, if enigmatic, presence. Others saw him as part of a shadow system that imposed its will through fear, making honest business more difficult and deterring people from seeking help from legitimate authorities. Over time, as court cases and media investigations laid bare the financial and social costs of organized crime, attitudes in many Italian-American communities evolved. The old romanticized image of the neighborhood protector sat increasingly uneasily alongside stories of ruined businesses, coerced agreements, and the quiet suffering of those who felt they had nowhere to turn. The justice system's response to Joseph and his peers likewise became more pointed and, in some quarters, more controversial. Supporters of aggressive RICO enforcement argued that men in leadership roles, even if rarely present at the scene of individual acts of intimidation or debt collection, should be held accountable for creating and sustaining the criminal enterprises that made those acts possible. They saw significant sentences for figures identified as captains or consiglieri as essential both to incapacitate experienced organizers and to send a deterrent message to would-be successors. Critics worried about the potential for overreach, about cases in which status within an alleged organization might overshadow the need for specific proof of involvement in particular crimes. In Joseph's situation, his own decisions to plead guilty in major cases sidestepped some of those debates, but the questions his prosecutions raised continued to echo in discussions of racketeering law more broadly. For historians, criminologists, and serious journalists, Joseph's life offers a window into the less theatrical but crucially important side of organized crime. The infrastructure of administration and finance that undergirded the more visible episodes of violence and courtroom drama. His career was built not on notorious hits or spectacular robberies, but on the steady, disciplined management of illegal markets and the relationships that sustained them. This emphasis on continuity and control helps explain both his longevity within the Gambino hierarchy and the intensity with which law enforcement eventually focused on him. A criminal organization that loses a few hot-headed street enforcers can often replace them quickly. One that loses experienced, trusted managers finds its ability to coordinate and profit far more seriously impaired. His story also highlights the complexities of individual agency within structural constraints. The Brooklyn into which he was born did not condemn him to a life in organized crime. Many contemporaries from similar backgrounds chose different paths. Yet the opportunities and pressures that surrounded him shaped the menu of options he perceived as available and attractive. Economic insecurity, limited access to education, and the presence of a powerful underworld subculture all played roles in channeling his talents toward illegal enterprise. Recognizing these contextual factors does not excuse the choices he made, but it does underscore why, for policymakers and community leaders concerned with preventing future generations from following similar paths, addressing only individual behavior without tackling broader social conditions will always be insufficient. In considering Joseph's legacy, it is important to resist both sentimentalization and demonization. On one side lies the temptation encouraged by decades of film and television to view seasoned mafia figures as quasi-romantic anti-heroes, whose loyalty and adherence to an internal code somehow offset the damage their enterprises inflict. On the other lies the impulse to flatten them into one-dimensional villains, devoid of context, whose lives can be easily dismissed as cautionary tales without further examination. The available evidence suggests that Joseph, like most people, inhabited a more complicated middle ground, a son, brother, father, and neighbor who, over many years, also chose to devote his considerable organizational skills to sustaining activities that harmed others and undermined the rule of law. As of the latest public information, he has not offered his own extended interpretation of that life. Unlike some former mafia members who have broken ranks to cooperate with authorities or to publish autobiographical accounts, he has remained silent beyond the formal admissions required in court. That silence is entirely consistent with the norms of the world he came from, where cooperation with government investigators is stigmatized and public self-analysis is viewed with suspicion. It also leaves historians and the public reliant on external sources, court records, law enforcement reports, and the recollections of others, each with their own limitations and potential biases. Piecing together a coherent narrative from such materials requires caution and a willingness to acknowledge gaps and uncertainties. What can be said with confidence is that Joseph "Jojo" Corozzo's life is inseparable from the history of the Gambino crime family and from the broader story of organized crime in post-war America. His early years reflect the conditions that allowed mafia organizations to take root in immigrant communities. His ascent through the ranks illustrates the internal logic and rewards of those organizations for individuals who proved reliable, discreet, and profitable. His prosecutions and prison terms chart the maturation of the legal and investigative tools deployed against such groups, and his later years, spent largely out of the spotlight, in a world that had changed dramatically since his youth, embody the fading of a criminal order that had once loomed large in the public imagination. The neighborhoods where he grew up and worked have moved on, their demographics transformed, their economies reoriented toward different industries and aspirations. Many of the social clubs that once served as informal headquarters for his generation of mobsters have vanished or exist only in faded photographs. Yet the institutional memory of his activities persists in the archives of federal courthouses and in the scholarly work that continues to probe how and why organized crime flourished for so long in American cities. For younger readers and viewers encountering his name in those contexts, he may appear as a figure from a distant, almost foreign era. For those who lived through the waves of indictments and investigations that marked the late 20th and early 21st centuries, he stands as one of the quieter but more enduring threads, connecting the old world of Cosa Nostra to the modern state's determined response. In the end, the image that lingers is not of a man in handcuffs or in the dock, though those moments were undoubtedly significant, but of the long, mostly unseen years in between, the countless meetings in back rooms, the negotiations over debts and territories, the cultivation of a reputation strong enough that his mere involvement could influence outcomes. It was in those routines, repeated over decades, that Joseph Corozzo built a life at the intersection of community and criminal enterprise. And it is in the dismantling of that intersection through law enforcement, social change, and the passage of time that his era is gradually passing into history.